The sound came first, not a scream, not a cry for help. Skin on concrete. It was a wet, unfinished sound. Flesh dragged across stone that had no sympathy and no memory. 4 steps, old steps, the kind that had carried groceries, tired feet, arguments, laughter, the kind that never expected to catch a body. The woman landed wrong. Her shoulder hit first, then her hip, then her back folded in a way bodies aren't meant to fold. The final stop was the sidewalk. Hard, flat, unforgiving. For a fraction of a second, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, the blood began to spread. It didn't rush, it seeped, a dark red stain blooming outward from beneath her dress, soaking into the thirsty cracks of Harlem concrete. The afternoon sun hit it just right, turning red to black, like ink spilled on a page that could never be erased. She didn't scream. That absence mattered. Pain usually announces itself. This one didn't. It sat inside her chest, coiled tight, pressing the air out of her lungs in short, panicked breaths. Her jaw locked, her teeth pressed together hard enough to grind, one hand flattened against her stomach, fingers splayed wide, as if she could hold what mattered most in place by sheer will. 7 months. The other hand braced against the bottom step, palm raw against concrete, keeping her head from falling back. She understood instinctively, before thought had time to arrive, that if her skull hit next, there would be nothing left to save. Her eyes were closed. Above her stood the man who had made this happen, Vincent Esposito, not a monster, not a mastermind, just careless. He stood at the top of the steps with his weight shifted back on one heel, hands still warm from contact. His face held no rage now, no satisfaction, only delay. The human brain takes time to catch up to the damage the body can do in an instant. 3 seconds. That's how long he stood there. 3 seconds where the universe offered him clarity, fear, remorse, understanding. 3 seconds where he could have knelt, shouted, called for help, done anything that might have rewritten the next 40 years. His brain arrived late, and when it did, it chose self-preservation. Vincent turned and walked away, not hurried, not panicked, just another man blending into Friday afternoon. Hands slid into pockets, head dipped, shoulders relaxed, the posture of someone who believed, deep down, that consequences were for other people. He didn't look back. Inside the grocery store, reality snapped back unevenly. A glass jar rattled on a shelf and tipped over, spilling beans across linoleum like scattered teeth. The register drawer sat open, forgotten mid-transaction. 6 people stood frozen, eyes locked on the doorway, unsure who was supposed to move first. An old man did. He burst through the door with a sound halfway between a gasp and a groan. His knees protested immediately. His back screamed. But his body remembered something older than pain. The reflex to help. He dropped beside her. His hands hovered uselessly above her body, shaking. He knew better than to move her, but he didn't know where to put his fear. He had lived on this block for decades, seen accidents, seen fights, seen blood. This was different. This was wrong. He knelt there, murmuring reassurance without words, watching her chest rise and fall too fast, counting breaths like numbers might keep her alive. He noticed the way her fingers pressed harder into her belly every time a spasm rippled through her body. He understood enough to be afraid. Someone else ran for a phone. Another voice yelled for an ambulance, the words stretching thin with panic as it bounced between brick walls. A small crowd gathered fast, 8 people, then 10, forming a quiet arc around the scene. No one filmed, no one spoke. Harlem knew when to be still. Minutes passed, long minutes. The blood cooled and darkened, losing whatever warmth it had borrowed from her body. It marked the exact place where gravity had won. When the ambulance finally arrived, it did so without urgency. No siren, no apology. The vehicle rolled to a stop like this was routine, which, in a way, it was. The doors opened. Two paramedics stepped out, faces blank, movements efficient and distant. Their eyes took inventory without attachment. A pregnant black woman, bleeding, conscious. Their hands did what training required. Their faces did not change. They lifted her onto the stretcher. The movement drew a sharp inhale through clenched teeth, the closest thing to a scream she would allow herself. One of them asked questions. Someone else answered. Dates, weeks, numbers. No one asked how it felt. The doors closed. The ambulance pulled away at the same speed it had arrived. The crowd thinned. People drifted back to their lives, carrying the image with them like a bruise that would surface later. The old man stayed. He stared at the stain on the steps long after the street had returned to its rhythm. He would scrub it later. Soap, water, a stiff brush. He would do his best. But concrete remembers. What no one on Lenox Avenue understood, not yet, was that this moment was already larger than the sidewalk could hold. This was not a random act of cruelty, not an argument gone wrong, not a man having a bad day. This was a collision between ignorance and power. Vincent Esposito believed he was invisible, believed he was protected by routine, by race, by the assumption that nothing truly bad happens to people like him. He believed this would dissolve into rumor. He did not know the woman he pushed carried more than a child. She carried a name that bent streets, a name that closed doors and opened graves, a name spoken quietly by men who preferred to stay alive. He did not know that somewhere across the city, a man would soon stand in a hospital ward filled with antiseptic and grief, say nothing at all, and decide that mercy was a luxury he could no longer afford. Vincent Esposito thought he had walked away from a problem. What he had actually done was press start, because death was never going to be his punishment. Time was, and time is crueler than any bullet. If you stay with this story, you'll see why the mob expected a body and got a living ghost instead. Hospitals have a smell that doesn't fade. Bleach, old water, fear disguised as cleanliness. By the time she was wheeled inside, the blood on her dress had gone sticky, cooling against her skin. The hallway lights passed overhead in a slow, mechanical rhythm, white panels blinking by like the seconds of a clock she couldn't see. Every bump of the gurney sent a tremor through her body, a reminder that gravity had already had its say. They moved her into a curtained space, not a room, a pause, a place meant for waiting, not for grief. The doctor spoke in controlled tones. Nurses moved efficiently, hands pressed, instruments clicked. Someone checked her blood pressure. Someone else checked. The clock. The baby's heartbeat was gone. It hadn't vanished instantly. That was the cruel part. Trauma like this works in stages, a rupture, a separation, a slow theft of oxygen. Life doesn't always leave in a rush. It sometimes lingers just long enough to make loss feel deliberate. She stared at the ceiling while they explained, at a hairline crack running through the paint, at the faint flicker in one fluorescent bulb, at anything except the truth settling into her chest like wet cement. 7 months of futures erased in an afternoon. They told her what would happen next. The body, once it understands there's nothing left to protect, begins the process on its own. Labor would come, not to bring life, but to end the illusion that it might still be saved. She did not cry yet. Grief doesn't always arrive as tears. Sometimes it arrives as stillness so deep it frightens the people trained to fix things. And then there was him. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson did not announce himself. He did not raise his voice at a desk. He did not demand attention. He did not look like a man about to break the city in half. He walked through the hospital the way men with true power always do, like the space already belonged to him. No hurry, no hesitation. The nurses noticed first. They always do. A subtle shift, a tightening of posture, the unspoken understanding that someone important had entered the building, someone who did not need permission. Bumpy reached her side and stopped. He did not touch her immediately. He looked. He took in the IV line taped to her arm, the way her hand rested protectively over her stomach even now, the absence where sound should have been. Her eyes were open, but they were not seeing the room anymore. He sat. And only then did he take her hand. It was warm, still alive, still here. For a long time he said nothing. Silence wrapped around them like insulation, keeping the rest of the world out. He did not ask questions that already had answers. He did not curse. He did not threaten God or doctors or fate. Men like Bumpy Johnson learned early that noise wastes energy. The doctors explained the damage, the fall, the separation, the impossibility of saving the child. They spoke carefully, choosing words designed to survive lawsuits and conscience alike. Bumpy listened. Every detail settled into him and stayed. When they finished, he nodded once. Then he stood. What happened next was not dramatic. That was the terrifying part. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He simply removed a thick roll of cash from his jacket, counted without looking, and placed it on the nearest surface. Enough to silence hesitation, enough to erase policy, enough to make sure his wife's pain would not be shared with strangers behind thin curtains. Within minutes, she was moved. A private room, a closed door, a space where grief could breathe without witnesses. Money didn't bring the baby back, but it did buy control. And control was all Bumpy Johnson had left. The mob heard about the incident before the sun went down. They always did. Whispers traveled faster than police radios in Harlem and Little Italy alike. A pregnant woman, pushed, lost the baby. The name attached to her spreading like electricity through criminal networks. The expectation was immediate and unanimous. There would be a hit. That was how these stories usually ended. A body in an alley. A warning shot echoed across territory lines. Clean, fast, understandable. Everyone assumed Bumpy would respond the way men like him always had. They were wrong. Because what sat with him in that hospital room wasn't rage. It was something colder. Grief changes men differently. Some explode. Others collapse. Bumpy Johnson calcified. The loss hardened inside him, layering itself over decades of restraint, calculation, and survival. He understood something the mob often forgot. Death ends suffering. Death closes the book, and Bumpy Johnson was not interested in endings. He was interested in memory. In consequence, that lingered. In a punishment that would not fade with time, but grow heavier with it. The man who pushed his wife was not worth a bullet. A bullet would have been quick, almost merciful. A period at the end of a sentence. Bumpy wanted a paragraph that never stopped. While his wife labored through a loss no one should have to survive, Bumpy Johnson made a decision that would ripple outward for decades. He chose the long game. A response so deliberate, so precise, that it would not just punish the man responsible, but educate everyone watching. This was not about revenge. This was about redefining fear. Because fear of death is common. Fear of living, trapped, helpless, forgotten. That kind of fear travels farther. It settles deeper. It teaches better lessons. And somewhere in the city, Vincent Esposito still believed he had gotten away with something. He was wrong. He just didn't know how wrong yet. They didn't chase him. That was the first mercy he never understood he'd been given. There was no scramble through alleys, no doors kicked in, no gunfire cracking the night open. Bumpy Johnson didn't believe in chaos when certainty would do. Chaos leaves witnesses. Chaos leaves questions. Certainty leaves silence. Vincent Esposito was found the way careless men are always found, by routine, by habits so deeply ingrained they feel like safety. He went where fear told him to go. Toward family, toward walls he believed were thick enough to stop consequences, toward men with last names and reputations who had survived worse. At least, that's what he told himself. Bumpy's reach moved without sound. Phones rang, doors opened. Information traveled hand to hand, not mouth to mouth. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. When Bumpy Johnson wanted someone located, the city leaned slightly in his direction, and the answer slid out. Vincent was lifted from his certainty without ceremony. No explanation. No resistance worth mentioning. One moment he was surrounded by familiar furniture, by the smell of cooked food and old money. The next, he was in the back of a vehicle with the windows blacked out, the engine's vibration bleeding up through the floor and into his bones. He asked questions. They were not answered. The warehouse waited at the edge of the water, abandoned but not forgotten. The kind of place where sound behaves strangely, where footsteps echo too long and silence presses back just as hard. The air inside was cold and tasted faintly of rust and salt. Old oil clung to the concrete floor, mixing with the smell of damp wood and thyme. In the center of the room sat a single chair, metal, bolted to the ground. It looked less like furniture and more like a decision that had already been made. Vincent was placed into it, not thrown, not shoved, guided, hands firm but unhurried, restraints bit down at wrists and ankles with mechanical finality. Plastic tightened. Metal clicked. The chair did not move. The room did not speak. There were no speeches, no explanations, no dramatic revelations, just the hum of distant machinery somewhere outside and the slow realization creeping up Vincent's spine that this was not a negotiation. He tried to scream. The sound came out wrong, thin, unconvincing, like a question no one intended to answer. Then the room changed, not visibly, but in weight. Bumpy Johnson entered alone. No entourage, no guards flanking him. Just a man in a suit that still carried the faint, unmistakable smell of antiseptic and loss. His shoes clicked once against the concrete and then stopped. He stood 3 feet away. He did not rush. He looked at Vincent the way a doctor looks at an X-ray, quietly, precisely, searching for the exact point where everything could be altered forever. There was no hatred in his face. That was the most frightening part. Hate burns hot and fast. Hate makes mistakes. What sat behind Bumpy's eyes was colder. He had already passed through anger. What remained was resolve, polished, settled, unmovable. This was not revenge. This was correction. Someone else entered the room. A man whose movements were economical, no wasted motion, no uncertainty. He carried an object wrapped in cloth, long and heavy, the shape of it communicating its purpose before it was revealed. The cloth came away. Metal caught the light, not sharp, not elegant, just brutally sufficient. What followed did not resemble violence as people imagine it. There was no frenzy, no repeated blows, no blood spraying against walls. There was positioning, measurement, a pause long enough for dread to mature fully. Vincent's body knew before his mind did. Muscles strained against restraints that would not give. Breath came too fast. Sweat bloomed across his forehead in cold beads. The man behind him adjusted his stance by inches. The target was small, precise. Where the skull meets the spine, where the entire body funnels. It's permission to move. A place most people never think about because they never need to. This was not about breaking bones. It was about severing possibility. The strike came once. The sound was wrong. Not a crack like wood. Not a crunch like film. Something deeper, duller. A noise that didn't echo so much as settle into the room and refuse to leave. Vincent's scream began, and then collapsed. His mouth stayed open. His eyes widened, but the sound fell apart somewhere between his lungs and the air. His body tried to obey. Nothing happened. Hands that had collected money, shoved strangers, lifted glasses, now lay perfectly still against metal armrests. Fingers twitched once, twice, and then surrendered. Legs that had carried him through streets and into confidence did not respond. They may as well have belonged to someone else. Panic flooded his face in waves. He tried again. Nothing. Breath came shallow and quick, chest rising and falling like a trapped animal's. His lips moved. A whisper escaped, thin, broken, terrified. He understood, not all at once, but enough. The man with the metal bar stepped back and waited. This was important. You don't rush confirmation. Minutes passed. Tests were done without instruments. A pinch, a pressure, a silent count. The body below the neck had become uninhabited territory. Present, but unreachable. Permanent. Bumpy. Johnson watched without expression. When it was finished, he nodded once. Not in satisfaction, in completion. Vincent was still alive. That was the point. Alive, and fully awake inside a body that had become a locked room. No movement, no escape, no future that involved forgetting. He had been reduced to a witness inside himself. They did not untie him. They did not speak to him. They left him exactly as he was, breathing, blinking, understanding. When the doors finally opened again, it was to daylight and distance, a hospital entrance, a place of healing unprepared for what waited in the chair. Pinned to his chest was a simple note. Clinical. Final. A statement of fact, not cruelty. Justice, written in a language doctors would understand. As the vehicle disappeared into traffic, Vincent Esposito remained behind. Alive. Broken. Remembering. He had not been killed. He had been converted from a man into a consequence. The body can survive almost anything. That's the lie modern medicine tells itself. What it doesn't say, what it avoids, is that survival is not the same as living. Survival can be a room with no doors. Survival can be breath without agency. Survival can be decades long. Vincent Esposito learned this lesson slowly. The first days were confusion wrapped in pain. Hospital lights burned into his retinas. Machines hummed. Tubes entered places he could no longer protect. His body was still warm, still technically intact, but it had become foreign territory, land he could see and no longer govern. Doctors studied him with professional curiosity. The injury was clean, unusual, almost elegant in its cruelty. The spinal cord had been severed at the exact place where motion begins. No surgery could reconnect what had been deliberately erased. They spoke over him. Not to him, because people speak to objects only when they believe the object can answer. When they discharged him, there was nowhere to send a man like this except away. Away from sunlight, away from relevance, away from the life he had believed was permanent. The nursing home smelled like boiled vegetables and disinfectant that never quite worked. Hallways echoed with the soft sounds of dying, coughs, moans, the rhythmic squeak of carts. Vincent was placed in a room with men 3 times his age, men who were already leaving. He was 28. They fed him through tubes. They turned him to keep his skin from rotting. They wiped him when his body forgot how to hold itself. He could not scratch his face when it itched, could not wave when someone entered, could not close his eyes, fast enough to hide his shame. At night, when the ward went quiet, his mind did what minds do when there is nowhere else to go. It replayed, the push, the steps, the silence. Memory became his only movement. 1 year passed. The world outside reorganized itself without him. Businesses changed hands. Names shifted. Men rose and fell. Harlem kept breathing. The Italian crews adapted. The street learned the lesson without needing explanation. Don't touch his family. 10 years passed. Vincent's parents aged rapidly under the weight of care and humiliation. Visits became shorter, then less frequent, then symbolic. Conversations dwindled into rituals with no comfort left in them. His uncle disappeared behind prison walls. His friends stopped coming. The phone stopped ringing. Time did what violence never could. It erased him socially while keeping him biologically present. 40 years passed. Vincent had been paralyzed longer than he had ever walked. His body learned stillness so deeply that even his thoughts slowed. Speech faded. Not because he couldn't speak, but because there was nothing left to say that mattered. He became institutional shorthand. The quad in room 7, staff rotated, names blurred, care became mechanical, adequate, minimal. The state paid just enough to keep him breathing. He outlived everyone who remembered him as dangerous. He became harmless by design. This was the punishment, not pain, obsolescence. On the other side of the city, life continued in a different direction. Mamie Johnson aged with intention. She carried grief like a scar rather than a wound, present, permanent, but no longer bleeding. She did not speak publicly about what had been done in her name. She did not need to. The city spoke for her. She understood something few ever articulate. Death ends a story. Time tells it. What happened to Vincent Esposito was not revenge in the cinematic sense. There was no release, no moment of satisfaction, only the long, grinding certainty that he would wake up every day trapped inside the consequence of one careless act. Justice, in its purest form, is not loud. It is patient. Vincent died quietly. No announcement, no gathering, no reckoning. A nurse noticed the monitors had gone still. A doctor confirmed what time had been working toward for decades. His body finally caught up to the sentence imposed on it. He was buried without ceremony. A number in a ledger, a plot without a name. The city did not pause. But somewhere else, flowers appeared once a year on a small grave. Fresh, unexplained, persistent. Because justice doesn't always arrive as a bullet. Sometimes it arrives as a lifetime. Sometimes it arrives as memory that refuses to fade. Sometimes it arrives as a man who thought he got away with something, only to discover that the true punishment was living long enough to understand what he had done. This wasn't a story about revenge. It was a story about time. And time, once set in motion, never misses. If this story stayed with you, remember, history isn't just written by the victors. Sometimes it's written by the consequences. Stories like this don't end. They disperse. They sink into sidewalks and stairwells. They lodge themselves in the way men hesitate before acting careless around certain names. Harlem didn't repeat this story out loud, but it adjusted its behavior around it. That's how real power moves, not through fear that screams, through memory that whispers. Bumpy Johnson never corrected the rumors. He didn't need to. The ambiguity was part of the architecture. Was it exactly as people said? Was it worse? Was it exaggerated? The uncertainty did the work for him. Every version carried the same conclusion. Some lines erase you if crossed. Years later, young men would hear fragments, not details, warnings. A story about a man who never walked again. A story about a mistake that never stopped happening. A story about how death was not the harshest sentence available. No one used names anymore. Names weren't necessary. What mattered was the shape of the outcome. The city internalized it. Violence became quieter. Decisions became slower. Respect gained a sharper edge. This was legacy. Not statues, not headlines. Behavior. Fear has stages. The first is shock. The second is panic. The third, most important, is imagination. Vincent Esposito's fate lived in that third stage. Men imagined themselves awake but immobile, present but erased, alive long enough to understand every second of the cost. The punishment scaled infinitely because it required no repetition, no maintenance, no reminders. Time handled enforcement. That's why it spread. Because the mind always goes further than the act itself. This wasn't cruelty for spectacle. It was discipline designed to outlive the man who ordered it. Mamie Johnson never spoke of forgiveness, not because she lacked it, but because forgiveness wasn't the point. She understood something colder and clearer. Mercy is personal. Justice is structural. What happened was not done to ease her pain. Nothing could. It was done to ensure that pain did not echo forward into other families, into other stairwells, into other moments of careless dominance. She lived with grief. Vincent lived with consequence. That was the balance. Revenge seeks relief. Justice seeks permanence. Revenge asks, "How do I feel better?" Justice asks, "How does this never happen again?" That's the difference history forgets. And that's why this story still matters, because the most terrifying power isn't the ability to kill, it's the ability to decide how someone is allowed to live.